Let
me just close that up.
okay.
Yeah, I can still hear some people talking, so somebody's not on mute.
Everyone, please turn off their mics. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, so good evening, and thank you, Jack, and our climate declaration for the kind invitation to speak tonight. And I research and write about emerging corporate sustainability issues broadly, and I've written several papers specifically about degrowth for investors and business people. And I'm continually growing my understanding of the possibilities of degrowth and the potential for businesses to have a positive role in a transition to a smaller post-growth economy. And I describe my work tongue-in-cheek as persuading the unpersuadable to think the unthinkable. And I know that Jack and others in the webinar are involved in outreach and lobbying on degrowth. And I don't think I speak only for myself when I say that it feels like we're on the edge of a quantum leap in the exposure of degrowth ideas to mainstream scrutiny. Degrowth has been around for about 20 years as a concept, and all of a sudden it's being highlighted in IPCC reports, books and papers, and articles are coming out on degrowth almost every month. And, you know, I see my own work being accessed much more than I ever expected it would be. So whether you're a degrowth persuader or a degrowth unpersuadable, or you just don't know anything about it, I think you could easily find yourself engaged in a conversation about degrowth in the near future, such as the sort of trajectory of interest. So as Jack said, tonight I'm going to spend about 35 or 40 minutes looking at two aspects of degrowth. First, we're going to explore degrowth as a mechanism to reach a sustainable economy. And second, we're going to look at the process of building societal acceptance of degrowth, including a quick look at how I encourage businesses to look at degrowth. And you might be wondering why I'm using the image of a zebra. Well, at some point in history, the zebra evolved away from its horse cousins and developed stripes to be able to thrive in its specific context. So I'm using the zebra to represent degrowth as an evolutionary idea, the right idea at the right time to respond to our generation's environmental and social context. So before we go too much further, let's walk through some basic definitions. And here's a well-known definition of degrowth by Georges Callas, who's one of the leading academics in the field. Georges says that degrowth is an equitable downscaling of production and consumption that increases human well-being and enhances environmental conditions. Now, people read this in different ways. Some people see the positives. They look at what degrowth delivers. They see fairness, well-being, enhanced nature. Other people look at this and see negatives. They see instability, recession, and job losses because they look at what degrowth costs, and they look at it through the lens of a growth economy, which delivers stability most of the time. Our current economy grows because it is built on debt issuance that has to be repaid with interest, and it is the constant striving to create value to repay that interest that drives growth. And that mindset has forged societal values of competition, individualism, and accumulation. So economic growth refers to an increase in the size of a country's total production of goods and services in the economy over a period of time. But it's also an economy that has caused extensive environmental degradation, including over-extraction, pollution, nature loss, and climate change. And that level of damage has made many people move into the sustainability sphere, be it activism or career roles, to try and effect positive change. But it has been said that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of growth. So, of course, a mechanism has been devised to enable the growth to continue, but to be more sustainable going forward. And that's green growth. Green growth means fostering economic growth and sustainable development while ensuring that natural assets continue to provide the resources and environmental services on which our well-being relies. And that's a definition from the OECD. What this means is that green growth is the promise that future economic growth will no longer positively correlate with environmental damage, but will be decoupled from it, potentially through technological innovation. And today's governments and business leaders are all on board with green growth. So those were some warm-up basic definitions, and this is our agenda for tonight. And as I said before, we're going to look at degrowth as a mechanism to reach a sustainable economy. And then we're going to look at the process of building societal acceptance of degrowth. Starting with degrowth as a mechanism to achieve a sustainable economy, a good place to begin is with an understanding of what a sustainable economy looks like. The donut economics model, which I'm sure you are all familiar with, it describes what is meant by a sustainable economy. It means meeting all the well-being needs in the inner pink circle, energy, water, food, etc., for all people, without overstretching nature across the Earth systems in the outer pink ring, land conversion, biodiversity loss, air pollution, and so on, in all places. And when we think about what a sustainable economy needs to achieve by 2050, it would have to provide well-being for 10 billion people, address nature loss, and transition us responsibly to renewable energy as a key part of addressing climate change. We're going to use these core dimensions of well-being, nature loss, and energy in a few minutes' time to analyze green growth and degrowth. So here's a visual representation of the pillars of the Sustainable Development Agenda and an illustration of the vectors of green growth. The sustainable development and green growth work together to build a sustainable growth economy. The Sustainable Development Agenda has three co-equal pillars visualized in overlapping circles. And this suggests that only small segments of the environment, society, and the economy will become sustainable at first, but the overlapping area could grow larger. But the implication is that broad unsustainability is permissioned to a large, though diminishing extent, for an undetermined length of time into the future. Green growth is a plan to improve human well-being by growing a sustainable economy. And this is to happen in two. First, decoupling growth from nature loss through improving efficiencies in the use of resources such as water, land, and mined minerals. And this is shown by the brown arrow, which sort of flattens out over time because nature loss is set to slow down as economic growth continues. Second would be decoupling.
Got it.
You got it. Oh, that's good.
Oh, dear.
And even the iPad's probably too old.
Decoupling growth from climate change through developing the renewable energy sector, electrification of industry, buildings and transport, and then carbon dioxide removal later in the century. And this is shown by the green arrow, which declines over time because climate change is set to slow down and then reverse as economic growth continues. And many people take sustainable development for granted as the only approach to sustainability, and green growth as the obvious delivery mechanism. But there is another way to imagine a sustainable economy. Circles on the right show how ecological economists see a sustainable economy. Society lives within the environment, and the economy is part of society. The difference between these two models is the ambition for the extent to which the economy would become sustainable. On the left, it is partially sustainable, which is realistic. And on the right, it is wholly sustainable. And of course, that is idealistic and would require a radical economic transformation from where we are today. Ecological economists believe the current economy has swollen to a much larger size than society needs and that the environment can tolerate. And they say we need to shrink parts of our economy. And the mechanism to achieve that is degrowth. So the degrowth plan is to slow down, stop, and reverse nature loss and climate change, which are the green and the brown arrows, by reducing industrial throughput, which is the blue arrow, because industrial throughput correlates with environmental degradation. And this would have the effect of reducing the size of the economy, which is the dark blue arrow, although that shrinkage could be slowed through circular and service economy shifts. But eventually the economy would reach a post-growth size and form. And to ensure continuing improvements in well-being, which is the yellow arrow, policy changes would restructure economic expectations to bypass the effects of recession. So to summarize so far, there are two suggested mechanisms to achieve a sustainable economy. Green growth is the incumbent idea to reach a growth economy that is absolutely decoupled from climate change. And degrowth is a new idea about reaching a smaller post-growth economy by reducing industrial throughput. So let's compare their approaches to well-being, nature loss, and energy, which are those core dimensions for a sustainable economy by 2050 that we talked about a few minutes ago. On well-being, the green growth approach is to grow wealth per capita everywhere, to improve well-being everywhere. This is a rising tide lifts all boats kind of idea. Rich global north nations have sufficient wealth to meet their citizens' well-being needs, although some countries do need to redistribute their wealth more evenly to meet all their citizens' needs. Richer nations continue to grow their economies to advance lifestyles even further and to retain power in global trade and global security. Richer nations fund the UN, the World Bank, and the IMF to facilitate sustainable development through loans to poorer nations so that they may grow their economy to meet their citizens' well-being needs. The degrowth approach would be to redistribute excess wealth to where it is needed to meet well-being needs equitably. Research shows that GDP growth correlates with well-being only up to a point, and after that it produces diminishing returns. All richer countries have excess wealth as far as well-being is concerned. Could they use some of that excess wealth for more equitable outcomes globally? Could fair trade and debt jubilees, for instance, be a way forward to relieve global wealth injustices? On the environment, the green growth approach to reducing environmental damage is decoupling, as we discussed a few minutes ago. Absolute climate decoupling requires carbon dioxide removal and storage. And there's a range of these technologies in development, but all are speculative at present, unproven at scale, needing to overcome issues around site variability, biodiversity and social impacts, land use requirements, energy requirements, and cost. And the longer it takes to develop and commercialize carbon dioxide removal technology, the more intense climate change will become, and the cheaper that technology will seem. In fact, Nobel Prize-winning economist William Nordhaus calculated that letting global warming reach 4 degrees C is cost optimal in terms of the balance of costs and benefits to the economy. And that estimation has had a huge impact on oil industry and government action on climate change. None of them want to incur unnecessary cost too soon, and that has slowed climate action. Which is why we have emissions pathways in IPCC reports that exceed 1.5 degrees C or 2 degrees C, and then come back down later in the century. It's also worth noting that with the focus on carbon dioxide removal, decoupling of economic growth from resource depletion and ecosystem damage has been somewhat forgotten in the green growth world. The degrowth approach is to redesign global provisioning systems, to focus first and foremost on meeting universal well-being needs, to avoid producing waste and surplus, and to ensure that local biophysical tolerances and ethical worldviews are respected in each locale. This would involve us all changing our biophysical footprint, which is the sum of household material consumption for nutrition, housing, household goods, mobility, and leisure. People in poorer nations would grow their biophysical footprint by about 30%, and people in richer nations would reduce theirs by about 40%. On energy, The green growth approach is rapid growth in renewables, energy efficiency, and electrification of industry, transport, and buildings. Global economic growth is placing such demands on energy that new renewable energy is additional energy. It is not displacing fossil fuels. Use of fossil fuels is expected to continue to grow to 2050 and beyond, increasing global warming. So just to reiterate, the green growth approach is to accept that global warming will exceed 1.5 degrees C, if not 2 degrees C by 2050, but to reverse this later in the century with carbon dioxide removal. The degrowth approach agrees with rapid growth in renewables, energy efficiency, and electrification of industry, transport, and buildings. But it is recognized that if global warming exceeds 1.5 degrees C, the planet will probably pass through irreversible tipping points with potentially catastrophic consequences for life on Earth that could not be reversed through carbon dioxide removal. So the degrowth approach is to avoid further global warming through phasing out fossil fuel use by capping extraction. By 2050, fossil fuels would provide just 20% of the energy mix and renewables 80%. On the basis that most projections suggest that renewable energy output can only double by 2050, we would have a 50 to 70% decline in global energy output from 2020 levels. And that would equate to a 1960s level of energy per person globally. And it is possible to live a comfortable, modern lifestyle at this low level of energy using current technologies. But we must also substantially reduce energy use on unnecessary goods, services, and activities. It generally comes as a surprise to green energy advocates to realize that they are actually advocating for degrowth, because a green energy economy has to be a smaller economy. In conclusion, green growth and degrowth are very different mechanisms for achieving sustainability, and each has its pros and cons. Green growth aims to meet well-being needs. It continues with that stability that we find in the growth economy, and it continues with the lifestyles that are familiar to us. On the downside, it knowingly exceeds 1.5 degrees C. It ignores climate tipping points. It relies on speculative technologies for future carbon dioxide removal. It preserves wealth inequalities, and it fails to address nature loss. Degrowth also aims to meet well-being needs. It meets Paris climate goals, and it anticipates an energy decline. It redistributes wealth, and it respects nature's tolerances. But it has untested policy combinations. It risks instability during change, and we would be unfamiliar with the lifestyle changes that it probably requires. So there are large holes in the idea of green growth that present an unacceptable risk to humanity, but there are also large holes in the idea of degrowth that are yet to be fully thought through. So we've now explored degrowth as a mechanism to achieve a sustainable economy vis-a-vis green growth. Green growth is strong in the policy landscape right now, but we have to question whether it will remain a politically viable idea if global warming passes through the Paris milestone of 1.5 degrees C, if climate tipping points are observed, and if the feasibility of carbon dioxide removal at scale remains uncertain. Degrowth lacks political viability right now, but its popularity may grow, attracting people who believe degrowth is a possible solution, as well as people who believe green growth is an impossible solution. Now we're going to move on to societal acceptance of degrowth. What does the process of acceptance look like, and how far has degrowth progressed along this path? Degrowth ideas are being planned and put into action across many levels of society. There are various agents of change, such as state level actors who create top-down change, and household level actors who create bottom-up change, and other types of change agent in between, including communities, enterprises, and the marketplace of lenders and investors. Types of action include stopping doing things or doing more or less of things within the status quo to produce degrowth aligned outcomes, as well as introducing new ideas to do things differently to replace the status quo. And the pillars of change are the areas of our lives that would be most impacted by a degrowth transition, including nature, work, society, money, and ownership. So a fictional portfolio of degrowth policies is listed in this circle, surrounded by the pillars of degrowth change. Now, the first proposal to limit extraction of fossil fuels would have an effect on nature, but it would also affect other pillars such as work. Businesses would have to run on renewable energy with lower energy availability and reduced resources coming through the supply chain. This would cause hours of operation to reduce with a knock-on effect on job security and income. So other proposals have to counterbalance the first proposal, such as mandatory work time reduction, job sharing and job guarantee schemes, universal basic income, and enhancement of universal basic services. A proposal that would affect society is the restriction of advertising, which would likely reduce consumption as people would be less triggered to purchase things they don't need. A money-related proposal would be debt jubilees, ranging from cancelling student debt to cancelling Global South debt. And this would free society from having to generate economic activity with the sole purpose of paying interest. A proposal that would affect ownership would be incentivizing cooperative business models such as employee cooperatives that distribute the value of an enterprise across the people who are directly involved in its activities, rather than as dividends to distant shareholders. Any package of degrowth proposals needs to work as a coherent plan, taking into account multiple effects. And this is what makes it so difficult to design a new political economy and why it's so important to model and trial degrowth policy ideas. The next challenge is how to get these degrowth proposals actioned in business and in government in ways that are effective and can be scaled up and are long-lasting. Effective transformation requires interventions all along this lever. Changes to the left are easier, but give little leverage, and changes to the right are progressively harder, but give greater leverage. So working from the left, incremental and impermanent interventions include parameter changes, such as a shorter working week, and feedback loop changes, such as speeding up the time it takes to plan, design, and construct active mobility infrastructure. Further to the right, transformative and longer-lasting interventions include structural changes, such as a ban on planned obsolescence, and mental model changes, such as setting a moon mission type goal that gets all parts of the system working together toward a shared vision. The key takeaway is that for a successful degrowth transformation, there needs to be multiple aligned interventions. So a systems-based theory of change is vital in policy setting. Degrowth can't be planned by a single government department or a single government layer. It has to be pan-governmental. We could expect an economic transformation to proceed through three phases: preparation, transition, and consolidation, but not in a linear way. Changes will emerge through the actions of many different change agents at different paces across different scales. Change starts at the bottom left corner at the micro scale. And this is where degrowth is right now, with plenty of experimentation occurring at the micro scale and some reinforcement at the meso or intermediate scale. We're seeing degrowth-aligned social movements such as plant-based eating, electric biking, tiny houses, and simpler forms of living, seeding change in society. And Instagram is a hotbed of degrowth-aligned influencers who are showcasing these lifestyle choices and making them more aspirational. Novel ideas and seed experiments are being commercialized up into the mesoscale. Often these are startups, so seed funding is important to a degrowth transition. Examples are car subscription services and sharing apps that support people who want to reduce their ownership of larger or less used items, like a car. Businesses reinforce novel ideas by expanding them to new adopters, for instance, by replicating their business in a new location. And different experiments can connect and combine to mutually reinforce one another. So a community kitchen could combine with a community garden and eventually become a neighborhood cooperative enterprise to give the community food independence and economic resilience. The next step is to articulate larger scale narratives, visions, and values, and this work has started. So Jason Hickel's book, Less is More, is a good example of creating a vision and developing a narrative. Another example is the success of Donut Economics, rolling out a transformation methodology for cities. And Donut Economics Action Lab will soon bring out guidelines for businesses too. And that has the potential to grow into a global community of donut businesses, similar to the global community of B Corp businesses. But ultimately, to structurally change the economy, ideas need to become politically viable by making their way through levels of public acceptance. Many degrowth compatible ideas have made it through in various places. Free public education and health have been successfully implemented in many countries for many decades. France has recently put into law a ban on planned obsolescence. And there are many universal basic income policy experiments happening around the world. But the larger concept of degrowth as a whole economic redesign is only just beginning to attract media attention. It has some way to go before it will be accepted and discussed in the mainstream as a sensible option. To make headway, it's important that degrowth coalesces with strong social movements such as the labor movement, women's rights, racial rights, environmental justice, and the climate movement. And this is the current thrust of degrowth academia. Because degrowth will be better supported globally if it is pro-worker, feminist, and decolonial. This is a lesson learned from climate activists who have been singularly focused and missed chances to dovetail climate policy with other social needs and have ended up competing for policy opportunities rather than collaborating for shared outcomes. And we can certainly see that climate action has been appropriated by capitalism with the support of the body politic, churning out carbon reduction and capture solutions that are harmful to people and places. And we see the proliferation of non-solutions, such as carbon offsets, that have a zero impact on climate, but are a huge opportunity for the financial markets. And we've also seen Indigenous voices and non-capitalist climate solutions being sidelined at COP meetings. As degrowth becomes more acceptable, green growth may become less acceptable. In fact, there's a lot of work underway to make that happen. Decoupling theory has been debunked for a lack of empirical evidence, and scientists, including Scientist Rebellion, are working to convince people that exceeding 1.5 degrees C will have effects on life on Earth that cannot be reversed. And this brings me to my work trying to build acceptance of degrowth in the business sector. So degrowth is a mission with a very clear vision and values. And there are many gaps in the details, but the amount of literature on degrowth is expanding exponentially. Yet when I started to look at degrowth through a business lens for my work, I found very little literature on it, nothing much written specifically for business people, and nothing at all for corporates. But I think this gap is one that needs to be filled, and my work has recently focused on this. When writing for specific readership, it's all about framing. You definitely have to use your reader's most important lenses, and you need to bridge between the language of the topic you're writing about and your reader's own specific language to build a new dialect. So I've used business resilience to frame degrowth to business people, picking up on a core business lens and a language set. To business people, change is a risk or an opportunity. So degrowth change is a risk or an opportunity. And building resilience is how businesses respond to risk. So that is how they can respond to degrowth too. Resilience to degrowth is about building the capacity first to adapt to degrowth related change as it materializes, and secondly, to transform themselves to be part of degrowth itself. In socio-ecological systems, which is what businesses are, adaptive capacity is associated with storing knowledge and building experience. But how do you build experience to something that hasn't yet happened? You play out plausible futures through scenario building, and you assess how the business model and strategy would hold up. So I recommend to businesses that degrowth scenario work is combined with climate scenario work. A way of doing this is to consider plausible degrowth policy changes that would impact greenhouse gas emissions. And these could be orderly changes or disorderly changes, such as a national work time reduction, or a global shift to plant-based eating, or an advertising ban in public spaces, or a rapid increase in active mobility in urban areas. And then introducing these ideas into the business's climate scenarios to create a fuller picture, and assessing the robustness of their strategy with this fuller picture in mind. Transformation is even more powerful than adaptation. It includes transforming the business to be degrowth compatible, as well as being a driver of degrowth change to alter the business context to the firm's own advantage. Things that can help a business become degrowth compatible include localizing the supply chain to reduce material footprints, shifting to more distributive ownership, such as becoming an employee cooperative, designing products for durability with modularity, easy repairability, and standard connections. It can be about moving into the sharing economy, perhaps in partnership with local social enterprises. And it's about respecting local nature by establishing local tolerances through consultation, both scientifically and ethically, and working with other local enterprises to allocate those tolerances and develop programs to operate within them. Things that a business can do to drive degrowth change includes being a policy entrepreneur to drive policy changes that push the risk of being degrowth incompatible onto less prepared competitors. Encouraging the local economy across all types of business to become a needs-focused demand-side market, shifting away from being a once-focused supply-side market. Being inclusive of local traditional and indigenous worldviews to build local identity across the business sector and cohesiveness around ethical boundaries. Supporting consumer change through adopting changing values around sufficiency, collaboration, localization, and regeneration. And investing surplus in the commons. Don't always pay dividends to shareholders. Invest in the workforce, invest in the community, build local resilience. Be a good corporate citizen. So in the last 6 months, I've produced 2 papers on degrowth, one for impact investors and one for business people. And when I released these, I braced myself for these to be contentious, but feedback has been 100% positive. And I don't take that to mean that there's any brilliance involved, but that the degrowth debate at the business level has not yet developed. And the surprising thing about these papers is that they've reached further than I imagined they would. The investor paper has been downloaded more than 1,000 times in 5 months, and the opportunity paper has been downloaded more than 3,000 times in just 6 weeks. And the fascinating thing is where this attention has sprung from. New Zealand take-up has been good, but by far the strongest interest has come from Europe, from the Netherlands, the UK, Germany, France, and Belgium. And as a result of these papers, I've connected with other people around the world who are also working in the same arena. And 2 examples are that I'm working with an overseas business school to build degrowth into some of their research into business practice standards. And I'm also working with a New York investment bank to bring degrowth ideas to their clients. And that second particular approach really surprised me at first. But when you think about it, it's obvious that an investment bank would move early on this. If degrowth does come over the horizon, whether it's planned and orderly or unplanned and disorderly, there will be winners and losers, and investors will want to know where to find risks and opportunities by predicting which sectors and businesses are more likely to build resilience and which ones are likely to fall foul of emerging regulatory change and consumer shifts. So as I was saying to you at the very beginning tonight, it does seem that degrowth's time to be in the spotlight has arrived, with people in surprising places beginning to get curious about a plausible alternative to growth. So that's an overview of societal acceptance of degrowth. And to summarize on that, there are many initiatives, but greater points of leverage need to be found, especially to make change that is transformative and durable. Political viability is some way off, but degrowth is moving in that direction. But what's ultimately needed is a coherent package of policy changes that can stand up to scrutiny through a period of debate and trials. We've covered everything now. We've looked at degrowth as a mechanism to reach a sustainable economy, and we've looked at the process of building societal acceptance of degrowth. And here's our zebra again, our symbol of evolution. So degrowth may be an evolutionary new direction for humanity, the right idea at the right time to respond to our generation's environmental and social context. My final thought I want to leave you with tonight is that common action is happening, but structural change is also needed to make change stick. And that requires political viability, which really does mean figuring out how to persuade the unpersuadable to think the unthinkable. And that brings us to the end. And thank you so much for listening. And back to you, Jack.
That was terrific, Jennifer. Thank you very much. That was a terrific overview of the issues regarding degrowth and comparing it with green growth.
Dr. Yoni Witten.
And I mean, just make sure I can. I'm just trying to control the screens here, the views. Just bear with me a moment. That's not quite what I want. There we are. Okay, this way you'll be able to see folks that would like to ask some questions.
Joe Biden is a fan of...
Could everyone please keep muted until you're called upon to ask a question? I'd like to start with a question about the role of profit that you would see for a business in a degrowth economy.
I think profit is something that's going to be maintained. I mean, every business needs to at least break even, and you need to have profit in order to develop research. You need to develop new ideas. You need to move into new markets, and businesses need to keep moving forward. So they definitely need to keep producing profit. It's more a matter of how that profit gets distributed. Does it get distributed to shareholders completely? Is the dividend, everything? Or is it being channeled back into, the workers? Is it being channeled into developing things in the community? Is it developing the commons? Is it developing new products that are more, have a greater use value to society? So definitely there's a role for profit in business.
Does that not imply GDP growth, though?
I think that in a degrowth economy, it's aggregate degrowth potentially, but not blanket degrowth. So there will always be businesses that are growing, seasonally, or they're startups and they have to reach economies of scale. The main thing is to degrow businesses that are producing goods that aren't needed, because we simply won't have the energy availability going forward to waste it on goods and services and activities that aren't needed. So the main thrust of degrowth will be ruling out or reducing throughput on products and services that aren't needed. But we'll definitely still be needing growth in some areas of the economy. And, you know, in the global south, they definitely need to improve their goods and services. They have well-being needs that aren't being met at the moment. So there'll be growth there too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a big issue, and then I'm sure that we'll be coming back to that. Are there, if you have questions, let's handle questions in the following way. At the bottom of the screen, there's a icon that allows you to raise your hand, which I've just done in the upper corner of my screen. And if you raise your hand, if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll try to take questions in turn and take advantage of Jennifer's availability to chat about some of these issues.
Oh, you did say to me earlier, Jack, that you thought that people might be interested in how to get businesses more involved.
Yeah. Well, I was going to start with another question regarding that, and you know, I reflect back on my own time of running my own business, and if people had come to me with these ideas, I have to admit that I would have had a very hard time accepting them because they're so radical and be so distracting to what I was doing and operating and trying to grow my business. So I'm really curious as to how you have found that encounter. I think you've said that people have come to you as a result of your papers, and I would encourage the people to have a look at the papers. They're really excellent and well worth a read. So are you just waiting for people to come to you as a result of these documents, or how are you handling these issues? Why, you know, if I was a business, you know, running a business, what would you say to me?
Well, I'm being kind of passive aggressive, I think, in my approach. I'm writing the papers and I'm distributing them as best I can through, you know, my extended network, mostly on LinkedIn, which is a tremendous, you know, asset for me, to be honest. And the reason why I'm being passive aggressive is that I don't think, as you know, your experience as a CEO tells you, you get people approaching you all the time, and you know your time is really valuable. And the last thing I want to do is go knocking on doors of people who don't know what it is, aren't interested, and are going to give me the brush off. I'd rather let it filter through the system in a more organic way, you know, with people in the business just basically saying, hey, you know, this is a really interesting idea. And that was one of the things that I wanted to do with the report that I wrote on the degrowth opportunity, was just to give people the information that they needed to have reasonable conversations within their workplace that wouldn't be contentious, that wouldn't wind people up who, you know, just want to dismiss degrowth right away as being some ludicrous idea. But it would give them, you know, really good in-depth information that would allow them to probe, you know, into different work situations and how degrowth could be applicable. Because, you know, as activists and academics and people like myself who sort of are at the more sort of advisory end of things, there's only so many problems that you can solve by sitting thinking about them. You actually have to get people who've got, you know, everyday problems in front of them, and they're the ones who are going to be problem solving degrowth. So, you know, my approach to it is, because I don't have businesses coming to me right now and asking me to talk about this. You know, I've got the investment bank that's very interested. I've got business schools that are interested, but businesses themselves aren't coming to me just yet, but I think they will. And what I'm trying to do is really build trust with the business community, that if I sit down in front of their board of directors, I'm not going to yell at them and say, you know, you've been crap for the last 20 years, you need to change. I'm going to bring insights and I'm going to build a dialogue with them. And, you know, I think one of the most constructive things that I can probably do next or within the next couple of years is try and set up some degrowth labs where we have businesses who want to have a safe space where they can come and discuss degrowth ideas with other businesses that want the same context, and they can pilot some ideas and they can talk about them. I think that would be really valuable. Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of pieces of advice that I would give businesses, but I haven't got to that stage yet.
I think you're wise to build trust, because when I think about my own experience, I reflect that I would only have listened to someone that I already had considerable trust in, at least to see what they had to say. So I think that's a good strategy. One of the things I'm curious about as to whether you would talk to them about managing risks. You know, you mentioned energy as a critical issue and the increasing likelihood of lower energy availability in the future. I mean, this has to be a serious consideration for any business. But are you using that sort of risk approach at all?
Well, obviously, I use the framing of resilience and adaptation and transformation. But in terms of specifics, I haven't really got into that. But I think, as I was saying to you before, you know, businesses are going to have potentially much less energy availability. So they're going to have to prioritize what they make. And that's, you know, that gets right down into business purpose. You know, what are they there to do? Are they there to make an exchange value product that, you know, provides them opportunities to, you know, give dividends to shareholders and make, you know, the money go round? Or are they there to produce goods and services that meet people's well-being needs? And, you know, that's a purpose question. So no, I haven't delved into specifics about energy, but when you look at purpose, you know, you're going to be looking at focusing on needs. So for most businesses, that's going to be a reduction in their throughput or a change in what they decide to make. So, you know, these are really big questions and I don't have the answers, which is why I think we need these labs.
Great, thank you. We've got a number of hands up. I'll try to take them in the order I at least noticed them. Colin, I think you had your hand up first there. If you would unmute yourself and put your question to Jennifer.
Thanks, Jack, and thanks, Jennifer, for a very inspiring talk. Certainly started us thinking the unthinkable, and that's the scary thing from my point of view. I just wanted to ask you something about one area that gets to me quite strongly, which is the distinction between wants and needs. Because you talk a lot about needs and you talk a lot about, you know, focusing the future economy of the future on needs and well-being. But for the last 70 years, we've been brainwashed into feeling that our wants are what are important, and people's personal requirements have been, you know, blown up out of all recognition. We have the right to travel the world. We have the right to buy this, that, or the other. You know, all kinds of luxuries. How are you going to change that conditioning, which is pretty deep for a lot of people, I would say the majority, into something which is much more well-being and needs focused, and the luxuries can be pushed aside?
Yes, the short answer is I don't know, but I agree with you that it is going to come down to focusing on needs and people shifting their value set. I mean, society has to shift its value set. The capitalism that, you know, we've all grown up with capitalism, certainly in the West, and you know, advertising, for instance, drives us to buy things that we don't actually need by convincing us that we do need them. And the reason why we have advertising is because we have a supply side economy. So businesses basically make what they want to make as in volumes that they want to make it, and they push it onto us. and convince us that we need it. And that is the thing that has to change. We need to change from wants to needs, and we have to change from supply side to demand side. And, you know, part of that is shifting societal values. So I think when you talk about, you know, changes in the economy from micro to meso to macro scale, that sort of bottom up shift, and those sort of influencers I'm seeing on Instagram who are, you know, giving us amazing plant-based recipes and are, you know, showing us videos of them cycling through town on their electric bike. They're incredibly inspiring. And I think that that is what's going to help people shift their value set as well as their behavior. And I think it's going to become at some point in the not too distant future, it's going to be the wrong thing to do, to be ostentatious and to have too much stuff. You know, I think it's where people are going to look at the energy decline and think, why do you have that, you know, 2 speedboats and, you know, a batch and on all the trappings of success.
Super yacht.
Yes. And, you know, it's not just going to be about the billionaires, it's going to be about normal society as well. We all have to sort of tighten our belts a little bit on this. And I think that's the value of the bottom-up seeding, and people who step into this early and, you know, do it well and make it look great and make us all want to do that, make it aspirational. I think that's how we'll do it, through aspiration.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Thank you, Colin. That's a great question.
Yeah, just to remind people, or if there's some new participants this evening, one of the webinars that is on the Our Climate Declaration website deals with this issue of basic needs that's you might want to have a look at. And Jennifer, with respect to that, you talked about reducing advertising. Do you see a potential role for advertising in encouraging the well-being movement and the movement from, you know, from wishes to needs?
Definitely. And the advertising industry has to change. And there are some industry bodies in advertising that are already onto that and are focused on, you know, turning down commissions for advertising with oil industries, for instance. And I think that will sort of develop and become more of a positive thing rather than a negative thing. So definitely, if the creative industry wants to survive, it does need to find work trying to encourage degrowth and other positive sustainability changes.
Right, thank you. Don Quick, you had your hand up. Did you still have a question, Don?
No, mine was about advertising, and I think Jennifer's been pretty clear in her answers. So thank you for that.
Yeah, there's a number of different things that can be done with advertising. I mean, you can start with targeting advertising for children, because obviously things like, and this is one of the areas that I think might have to change, is children's toys. You know, children get toys and they play with them for 6 months and then they don't use them again, and they, you know, they're a waste. They're a wasteful product. And advertising to children is something that might be a good place to start.
Good. Caroline Taylor, would you like to put a question to Jennifer?
Hi, Jennifer. Thanks so much. This is really fascinating. Just wondering about what you think. What sort of advice would you give to policymakers where the public acceptance of environment is complicated or contentious, as it is at the moment? What sort of, how would you suggest they try and negotiate that?
Well, as I was saying in the presentation, that we really need a coherent package of policies. And, you know, you can do one thing and it pulls one lever, and another lever somewhere else needs to be pulled in the other direction. They need to be counterbalancing. And I think, you know, policymakers need to get together globally and be discussing degrowth policy changes and doing experimentation. And I know, for instance, there's experimentation happening in Austria at the moment on a job guarantee scheme. And of course, they're looking at all other factors in that particular town where that scheme's being offered, and they're going to run the scheme for 3 years and just see what other things change that they would have to take into account if they did a job guarantee scheme. And the same thing is happening in Kenya on universal basic income, and has happened in California and in Alaska on universal basic income. And it sounds as if it's very slow moving, and it is, because, you know, these are experiments that are actually happening in the public, and they're taking, you know, 2 to 10 years, some of them, before they gather enough data for them to be able to say, yes, we think that we should do universal basic income because it gives us all these other positive effects and we can manage the negative effects. So I think just that experimentation and that talking globally among policymakers has to be the way forward. Thank you, Caroline.
Thank you.
We have a question here from Polly, who isn't feeling terribly well, but wants to put a question anyway, so I'll read it for her. I was wondering whether you think the concepts of zero waste and circular economy are useful when talking about degrowth. How do you see those concepts connected?
Yes, both, definitely. I see circular economy as part of degrowth. I mean, some people think that they're the same thing, that they're not. Obviously, circular economy gives us efficiencies and it slows down our extraction, our resource extraction. But circular economy, the rotation of materials through the industrial system, there's only so many times certain materials can go through before they're not able to be used again. I mean, I think glass and aluminium might be ones that can be used indefinitely, but certainly not plastics or fabrics or things like that. So, you know, reducing our use of things is as important as recycling them through the industrial system. And obviously people who are living a zero waste lifestyle or trying to do that at home, I know how difficult that is. You know, they're breaking boundaries in many ways because, you know, they're asking their councils to, you know, provide perhaps composting, you know, municipal composting facilities and things like that, which are, you know, really useful to zero wasters if you're living in a place where you can't have a compost bin or something like that. So they do push boundaries. They do get councils to change. They do get supermarkets to change packaging, you know, and recycling bins and things like that. So all of these things add up, and I think they're really important for seeding change.
Okay. Thanks. Don, before I come back to you, Joanna here has a question.
Yes, well, sitting next to the facilitator, he might rule it illegitimate. But I wanted to ask you, Jennifer, if you might tell us a little bit about your background and the development of your ideas, because as I look around the people on this webinar, there are faces that I recognize for years and years and years. And it's as if you've dropped like an angel from the skies into our midst. And I'm most curious to know a bit about how you know, your background, and how you shape the ideas, and how you come to be here.
Okay. Well, how can I begin? I began my career as a chartered management accountant. I worked in manufacturing, motor manufacturing. And I also worked in forestry. So I've worked in finance and IT roles early in my career in several industries. And then laterally in my career, I ended up in the infrastructure industry. And I worked in leading the development of submissions for major infrastructure projects. And then I basically took up sustainability ideas in that space because I could see how infrastructure is the perfect place to, you know, create wonderful benefits and outcomes for society. But I also saw that in those projects, there were lots of opportunities that were overlooked because, you know, time and cost and efficiency were more important. So that made me realize that there were a lot of opportunities to improve sustainability in that space. But it also made me realize that, you know, a lot of people simply don't value or don't understand sustainability. So at that point, which was probably 4 or 5 years ago, I moved out of corporate and basically set myself up as this independent sort of researcher. And I started looking at broad sustainability issues. And I was most interested in emerging practices, and basically using my communication skills, if you like, to translate those to a corporate audience, combining my interests and my experiences. And I developed my website, heliocene.org, which is basically a Creative Commons publishing platform for me to present my work. And I ended up working in the impact space, in the infrastructure space too. I worked for the Infrastructure Sustainability Council for a while. This was last year, developing an industry impact program for them, which was really an incredible experience. I really enjoyed that. And because I look at emerging practices in business sustainability, I'm always trying to look at the horizon and look what's coming next. So, 2 years ago, I was looking at the convergence of corporate reporting and noticing the differences in attitudes about materiality. And you can see that now that businesses are talking about the ISSB and the European Commission's corporate reporting arguments about materiality. So it takes, when you look on the horizon, it takes 1 or 2 years for those things to come into the corporate arena as, practical things that they're having to talk about now. So I'm always trying to look 1 or 2 years ahead. So I've been looking in recent years at biodiversity as well. And now we've got the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures has just released its framework for public consultation. And, I've been looking at degrowth only about 1 year and started writing about it about 5 or 6 months ago. And now we see the IPCC's Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 reports this year mention degrowth for the first time. So, I'm just always trying to stay up with what's emerging. And that's what I'm doing. And the next thing I'm looking at, because degrowth is part of what I do. It's not everything I do. So I'm also looking at the moment at regenerative business. And, I think that's going to be part of the degrowth solution set. So that's why I'm looking at regenerative business.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Barbara Hammonds, you've got your hand up. You haven't asked a question yet. Go ahead.
Well, thanks very much, Jack. And thank you, Jennifer. This is so exciting. And I think you're right that it does feel like it's an idea whose time has come. And the way you put that presentation together is just terrific. I'm going to enjoy being able to look at it again. And I've already shared it with some people I'm working on a climate project with. Not that I can share the link yet because it won't be up, but I've said, could look at this website, which will have your presentation up on it soon. And I was listening today to a podcast, the podcast Outrage and Optimism, which is with Christiana Figueres and Tom Rivett-Carnac. And this was one from a few weeks ago where they were talking to Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, or the City of London. And it was really interesting hearing him talk about how he brought people along with him to do the things they've done in London in terms of cutting their greenhouse gas emissions, and how he framed it in terms of health and the health impacts of cutting internal combustion engines in the city. And I just wondered whether, like you talked about the good life for all within planetary boundaries and that kind of thing. In terms of, I don't really know what my question is, but talking to businesses, some of whom would probably have very wealthy CEOs or very wealthy, shareholders. I just wonder what kind of response some of those people have, because they probably already think they've got the good life. But obviously people like us are looking at it in terms of everybody having a better life.
Yeah. I mean, I think that some people are just not going to change. and you can't convince everyone. And so there are always going to be people who, you know, will be chasing a different mission. And I think as much as we talk about degrowth as being an ideal and something that we're striving for, I honestly think that the reality is going to be more of a hybrid future economy with capitalism and degrowth forces working perhaps in tension, but also potentially in unison. I mean, they could work together. I don't know how that would happen, but I don't rule it out. And so I accept that there will be some people who will just carry on as they always have done. I just hope that the majority of people will find ways to live a good life more simply and not feel that they're giving something up. And part of that, honestly, is business figuring out in their supply chains and in their value chains how to change global provisioning so that we get the things that we need in ways that make us comfortable and make us live a modern life. So we don't feel like we're going back to the lives that our great grandmothers had. Because, you know, I am concerned about women's rights. I am concerned about racial justice. And I think all of these things would perhaps be lost if we did have to go back to that old-fashioned way of living, you know, because, you know, women would be under pressure to give up their jobs and look after, you know, relatives because all the jobs would be taken up by the men. Well, we don't want that. We want job sharing. We want job guarantee schemes. We want universal basic income. We want, you know, people to have convivial neighborhoods. We want all of that. And I think because we want it, we're going to get it.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Thank you. Sharon Morcom. Go ahead, Sharon. You're on mute, Sharon. Unmute yourself first.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was the most incredible, you know, presentation. You've put such a lot of effort into that. So it was so well presented and very clear to understand. So just one little question I had was, do you see an opportunity or the likelihood of being able to form a body of people that will have representation from industries and businesses who will have perhaps the wisdom within their own areas that could provide you know, some overall input into how degrowth could be facilitated, either a national body or an international body? Do you see that that might be something that will happen in the future?
I think we're very early days in degrowth right now. I know that we're all interested in it, and I sometimes have to remind myself that I think and live and work in a bubble, and you know, the vast majority of people just aren't with us on degrowth, not yet. I think what you're talking about is a great idea, and I think it will definitely happen if degrowth picks up interest, because that would be a natural step. And I think one of the stepping stones to that would be to emulate the work of Donut Economics Action Lab, which has been rolling out their methodology to cities and is about to roll out their methodologies to business. And I think, you know, they're actually in the same space. I know Erinch Sahan, who works, who leads the Donut Economics Action Lab for Business. And I know what he's doing, and it's very parallel to degrowth. So I think that it would be a natural step to emulate that in the next few years. And hopefully that will build into a global movement of interested businesses who are doing pilot studies and talking to one another and shifting the needle.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Don Quick, did you have another question, Don?
Yes, I did.
You just left your hand up.
No, I did have another one. And to some extent, it was good that you asked Joanna to come first, because I think she was approaching some of what I wanted to hear anyway. And then subsequently, Jennifer has elaborated a little bit, and it was just really talking about horizons. Mm-hmm. In that it seems to me that you're, and thank you for your presentation. It's very clear. I'm very happy with it, but it's still very, it feels very anthropocentric, if you like. And it's still, you talk about values and you talk about the environment, but in some ways, it seems to me in those values, well, it seems to me we are going to be forced, like it or not, to recognize nature as something that we have to ally with rather than adapt, mitigate, or generally be separate from and manipulate. I'm thinking of, and in that line, I think along also not only how you see how we can work with nature in the future and the horizons that some indigenous peoples can present to us, like, we are part of the forest, which most of us are not part of the forest, of course, in Western style things. And how you persuade, you talked about working in infrastructure. I was interested by how, for instance, infrastructure New Zealand presented the importance of corridors, but the corridors were seen as transport and ways of moving material. But on the other hand, if you're working with nature, you can see those corridors as being something where nature can move from nature into city and on, so on. So I think those are some of the horizons that I'm asking you about.
Mm. Yeah, I think I look at horizons too, is because I think they're very important to regenerative business, because they're paradigm shifts in a way that you're talking about.
Yep.
And, a lot of people can't even see outside their own paradigm. They don't realize they're in a paradigm. They're like a goldfish in a bowl. A goldfish doesn't realize he's in water. He doesn't realize he's in a bowl. And so part of it is the sort of narratives that we build that, encourage people to think outside the current paradigm and begin to accept that while the next paradigm might have things in it that you're a little bit frightened of and you're a little bit intrigued about, there is actually a radical mindset shift that has to go to get you from A to B. And, that's the really hard part. But I think talking about horizons and futures, and a lot of people are getting more interested in that. And I think that's a really good gateway into getting people to think about degrowth in positive ways. Because before degrowth came along, people had this sort of linear trajectory about the future. It was just going to be more of the same, but better, or more of the same, but worse. Whereas now we're talking about a new track, and it's a different future. And I think people haven't really got their head around, paradigm shift. And so that is the big challenge.
I suspect that nature is going to force it on us one way or the other anyway.
Yes, talking about futures is anthropocentric, which is what you were saying at the beginning, and, wanting things to be more environmentally focused. But, when it comes to business, I have to take an anthropocentric approach, because business is all about employing people and providing goods for people, and nature is our ingredients larder, if you like, and we have to look after the larder. So, it's business struggles to see itself as subservient to nature, but it is going to have to get there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We have another question from Sadaf Lari, if I've got your name correct, Sadaf?
Yeah, you got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to thank you so much. Thanks, Jennifer. That was really fascinating, that whole presentation, and I just want to echo everything that everyone's saying about it being really clear and you setting it up in that way. I'm not going to be able to articulate this question in anywhere near the same kind of clarity that you have, but there's something about the way that you're describing this in terms of paradigm shift and changing the way that people behave and think, quickly, and this transformation that you're describing that kind of is has alarm bells attached to it, which, although what you're describing, seems objectively for the betterment of the environment and well-being, and the fact that to me it seems like every instance where one mindset has sort of tried to supplant another, the backlash to that, or the result of that, is often not great, even if the intentions are good. And what is the thinking around how to deal with that? You know, while we can sort of, you know, understand that to, you know, get rid of the excess and what the, you know, and the wants and focus on the needs, trying to figure out what those two things are is so problematic. It's not an objective truth, you know, the need necessarily. I mean, is there or is there not? I don't know. I mean, do you get what I'm sort of prodding at here in terms of supplanting a new way of thinking on a society that, you know, do you know what I mean? Does this make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like it's the same as the bottom up and the top down. I mean, more and more data is being developed. Projections are becoming clearer. Of course, there are predictions and, you know, we don't know the future, but there are more and more narratives about plausible futures and ranges of plausibility. And businesses and governments need to operate within that range of plausibility. And as we move forward, things will fall off the edge of plausibility and we'll get, you know, a clearer idea of what lies ahead in terms of like energy in particular. And I think that will drive governments to set stronger policy. And I think at the same time, you know, the public will be aware of that, and there will always be a first mover part of society that will start to sort of show the way in terms of behavior change. So we'll have bottom up and top down. And, you know, the market and businesses, they're the ones going to feel the pressure from regulations and from consumer shifts. So they will have to respond in some way. So, you know, and my work is to warn them that that's coming so that they can't turn around and say, well, this is a surprise. Well, I'm sorry, but I've been talking to you about this for 2 years or 3 years. And some of the businesses that have been listening are streets ahead of you. They've already got a plan in place. They've got a pathway into degrowth. And, you know, they're set up. So, yeah, I mean, the squeeze is going to come from both sides. And so I think it does have substance, but that substance is ever forming. It's ever developing. Is that what you meant? I wasn't quite sure.
Yeah, I do mean that. I think it's more, there's something in me that sort of worries about, you know, cutting, you know, talking about needs and wants. It's a interesting area, you know, to sort of businesses exist because people want them to do things. They want the things that they make. You know, businesses don't tell people what, I mean, they do. It's a cycle, but, you know, it is consumer led. People want these things, and so they make them, you know, and they always have to think about that when they're making things. So to put it on the business to stop making the things that people don't want, you know, only make things that people need and not things that they want, when they're telling you that, when the people don't understand what the difference is between the two, really. Right. Do you know what I mean? Like that whole system, it's kind of hard for me to sort of figure out which lever it is. But like you say, it's going to come. That disruption is coming to all businesses one way or another. It's coming. And I guess the bottom line is that, you know, like talking to businesses and preparing them for a disruption, no matter what, that's good. But there's just a tension in me about the want and need chat and what that really means, and to who decides for whom what they want and need. And that seems problematic to me.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to a previous question about advertising and how, you know, we don't realize how impactful advertising is on the choices that we make. Even people who say that they're minimalists, you know, they're turning over their belongings. They're not purchasing. And so, you know, I think advertising is one of those things in modern life that we don't even realize what an impact it has on us. So that's why degrowth academics suggest an advertising ban, because it would completely take away those triggers that make us want to buy things that we think we need.
Yeah, for some insight into just how powerful advertising has been over the last several decades, there's a very interesting BBC series called The Century of the Self. I highly recommend it if you really want a good understanding of how business and governments have come together to create these needs and to stimulate the economy the way it's gone. Mark Croning, I see you've put a question mark in the chat. Would you like to put it directly to Jennifer and so everyone can hear it? Are you still there? Hi, Mark.
Yeah, g'day, Jack. Happy to. I mean, maybe this is already being touched on a little bit already, but happy to read it out and see if it goes any further. So in brackets, how can enough of the levers at the scale commensurate with our physical reality be pulled without pulling Dinel's level number 2 paradigm shift, let alone lever number 1. So for those who have a disproportionate influence in our current human systems, isn't adopting the paradigm of humans are nature, and therefore must be in relationship with all of nature for our shared environment to continue supporting all life, including humans? Isn't this mandatory, this paradigm shift?
From a degrowth idealism point of view, yes, the paradigm shift is absolutely essential. How far that goes, I don't know, which is why that diagram, that Donella Meadows diagram, is really useful, because it makes you understand that some of the changes that we make for degrowth are incremental or are not going to be permanent. And it just shows you how hard you have to work. And that's one of the reasons why I push my work to corporates and to investors, is because I think they're further along that lever. And I think that getting some of them to change their minds and to sort of seed that mindset shift in those echelons of our society would give me greater leverage. So, you know, and part of that is it's really useful, the number of books that are coming out about degrowth right now, because, you know, and people like Jason Hickel are academics, he's an anthropologist, but he's writing in layman's terms what degrowth is about, and he's writing about it in sort of quite appealing and sensationalist and, you know, almost like fictional storytelling terms. And that's really, really valuable. And that's part of, you know, describing the paradigm shift. So whether we'll get there or not, I don't know, but step by step, I think people are working on that.
I've got another question. I don't see any hands up. I'll take the opportunity. I was delighted that you made reference to ecological economics, because that field has really preceded the degrowth movement. In fact, I would argue is one of the major drivers in giving rise to it in intellectual and academic circles. And one of the proposals for dealing with degrowth is that degrowth is a means to an end in ecological economics, and the end is a steady state economy. And I'm interested in how you would see framing this issue of a steady state economy to a business audience.
I think steady state economy is just one view within the ecological economics field. I think that there are other people in that field who don't necessarily believe in a steady state economy. If you're talking about the Herman Daly point of view, yes. Is that what you mean? Right.
Yes, indeed.
Right. I don't think it's necessary to frame that to business. I think that's a nuance within the field that business wouldn't necessarily need to know about.
But what about a goal? I mean, in terms of degrowth to what? I mean, obviously, how do we measure when we've degrowthed enough?
Right. Well, I mean, I think, you know, we don't have the silent spring anymore that Rachel Carson was talking about. I think we will see, you know, insects being more prolific in some spaces where they weren't, where they died away. You know, we're going to see nature coming back. We're going to see more equality in society. We're going to see global South nations having sovereign, you know, financial wealth. We're going to see sustainable development goals being ticked off. You know, those are the things, the KPIs, the global KPIs that they're going to, you know, movement's going to happen on those. That's when we know that we're moving in the right direction. when will we ever know if we're there? I think we'll know when enough is enough. I think we will know if we start slipping backwards and we say, okay, that was the wrong thing to do. We need to go back to what we were doing before. I don't think that there is a goal that you can say categorically or definitively, that's our goal, that will be when it's enough. I don't think anybody has that kind of information.
What about measures like the planetary boundary framework, like ecological footprint? I mean, they've put some empirical thresholds on these topics. So it's not a matter of, just trying to do better and making things less unsustainable.
Right.
You're either sustainable or not. It's kind of like being pregnant or not. It's a state. It's not a, you can be sustainable and more resilient. You can be unsustainable and in grave danger, but they're two quite different states. And it seems to me that understanding empirically where that boundary is critical for how we organize our society and our economy.
Right. Well, I mean, I think we're working to a number of different boundaries. When you think about the Paris 1.5 degrees C sort of goal for global warming, and I'm not sure how that compares with the 350 parts per million planetary boundaries for climate. I don't think that they're the same thing. So, we're working to different boundaries. So there's always going to be disagreements about what that boundary should be. And empirical evidence is historical evidence. You're talking about a future goal, and there's always going to be disagreement on that. And, future goals can't just be scientific. There are ethics involved as well. And biocentric worldviews and biocentric, capabilities can shift what a scientific boundary could be, because we've got traditional communities around the world that can actually increase the biomass that a particular region can produce just through their own interventions. And that would shift the needle on what the boundary would be for that region. So it's a balance between science and ethics and history and future ideas. So I don't think there's a definitive goal that we could all settle on.
That's an interesting, we could have another whole conversation on that one, but I'll go back to Sharon, and then Sam, whoever's got the Samson. Go ahead, Sharon.
Sorry, here I come. Where is it? There it is. Okay, sorry. I just wanted to ask you, Jennifer, have you got any specific plans to get the information that you've relayed to us today into the public arena? Have you got some plans to work with media to try and get this to a wider audience?
No, not really. As I was saying to Jack, I'm kind of passive aggressive. So I'm not really interested in media, to be honest with you. I just put my work out there, and if people media.
Sorry, I lost you there for a minute, but I didn't hear all that, but I got the point.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Sharon. Whoever's got their hand up there is identified as Sansom. Galaxy, you have a question there? There you
yes. Yeah. Kia ora, Jennifer. Thank you. I've heard talk of paradigm and mind shifts. So to give me an idea of what they are, can you give examples of these that have happened in the past?
Well, that's difficult, but I think probably Marx was a paradigm shift in terms of inspiring the communist states. That was a paradigm shift, completely different political economy that he inspired. So, that's one thing, Marx and Engels on that. Mindset shifts, things like when Kennedy decided that America would get to the moon, that was something that entire society, in fact, the world had never imagined would ever be possible. And he changed people's minds about that. So I would describe that as a mindset shift.
Thank you.
Other examples would be the growth paradigm itself was a paradigm shift, and again encouraged by the marketing and advertising industries. Prior to that, people were concerned about meeting their needs. Anyway, we've come to the end of the time, and we've used your time well. I think we really appreciate the presentation and your articulate dealing with the various questions that have come up. So many thanks, Jennifer, for your contribution tonight and for your ongoing work. And I'm sure that everyone here wishes you great success in getting through to the business community. And it also raises the question that we probably don't have time for, but that is our roles as consumers in terms of focusing and supporting those businesses that are trying to make these kinds of transitions to focusing more on well-being issues and ensuring that needs are met. And by the way, I think one of the reasons that we might have even had more participants tonight is that we're competing with a webinar by Gareth Hughes on the well-being economy. And there's a well-being hub in New Zealand. And if any of you are interested in that, you might Google that and learn about the well-being economy, which is an international movement that has some parallels with the degrowth movement. And I think is another very useful and important initiative that's happening. So, well, thank you all for participating, for your questions, for your attendance, and again to Jennifer, and all good wishes to you in your work.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for the great questions. That was really great.
And keep tuned all, and we'll be continuing the series throughout the coming months. So keep checking into our website for updates. And if actually we're looking for somebody who can help us with the website. If anyone knows of someone who has the skills to do a couple of hours a month, keeping the website up to date, please get in touch, and we'd be delighted to receive your assistance. Thanks all, and be well. Good night.